"You're nothing but a waitress," said the billionaire CEO, but when he looked up, he recognized his ex-wife. "Are you ready for a story that will completely change how you see success, love, and second chances?" Today, we're diving into an incredible tale that proves sometimes life has the most unexpected ways of teaching us what truly matters. If this story moves you, like I know it will, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications because you definitely don't want to miss stories like this one. Trust me, what you're about to hear will stay with you long after the video ends. Let's begin. The September evening air in Manhattan carried the familiar blend of exhaust fumes, street food aromas, and the distant hum of 8 million people pursuing their dreams in America's most unforgiving city. The golden hour sunlight filtered through the urban canyon of skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the bustling streets of Midtown, where power brokers and dreamers intersected daily in an endless dance of ambition and survival. On the 42nd floor of the prestigious Meridian Tower, the executive dining room of Sterling and Associates hummed with the quiet confidence of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany tables where deals worth millions were discussed over perfectly prepared meals. The restaurant, Le Bernardin's private dining concept exclusively for the building's elite tenants, represented everything that separated the powerful from everyone else: exclusivity, perfection, and a price point that ensured only the right people could afford to be there. Alexander Sterling sat at his usual corner table, the one that offered commanding views of Central Park and the sprawling metropolis beyond. At 38, he was the embodiment of American corporate success, devastatingly handsome with sharp features that belonged in a men's fashion magazine, steel-grey eyes that missed nothing, and an aura of controlled power that made lesser men instinctively defer to his presence. His custom-tailored Armani suit fit his athletic frame perfectly, the result of personal trainers, nutritionists, and a lifestyle where image was as important as substance. Sterling and Associates, the private equity firm he had built from nothing over the past 15 years, now managed assets worth over $12 billion. His name appeared regularly in Forbes, Fortune, and the Wall Street Journal, always in contexts that reinforced his reputation as a brilliant, ruthless deal-maker who could turn failing companies into gold mines. His penthouse apartment in Tribeca was featured in Architectural Digest. His art collection was valued in the tens of millions, and his personal net worth had crossed the billion-dollar threshold 2 years earlier, making him one of the youngest billionaires in New York. But success had come at a price that even his vast wealth couldn't fully compensate for. His personal life was a carefully managed series of strategic relationships and public appearances designed to maintain his image as Manhattan's most eligible bachelor. He dated models and socialites, attended charity galas and exclusive events, lived a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt increasingly hollow as the years passed. Tonight was no different from dozens of others. Another business dinner with another group of potential investors, another opportunity to expand his empire and add more zeros to his net worth. Across from him sat 3 men who represented old European money, the kind of generational wealth that bought respectability along with returns. They were discussing a potential acquisition, a chain of luxury hotels across the American Southwest that could be restructured, rebranded, and flipped for a substantial profit. "The numbers are compelling," Alexander was saying, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about a major deal. "We're looking at a 40% return on investment within 18 months. Possibly higher if we can streamline operations more aggressively than projected." Heinrich Müller, the lead investor from Switzerland, nodded thoughtfully while reviewing the financial projections spread across the table. "Your track record speaks for itself, Mr. Sterling. But I must ask about the human cost of these streamlining efforts. How many employees are we discussing?" Alexander's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Approximately 800 positions will be eliminated in the first phase, another 300 in the second phase. The hospitality industry is notoriously overstaffed. These people are easily replaceable with more efficient systems and processes. The casual way he dismissed the livelihoods of over 1,000 people didn't escape the notice of the European investors, who exchanged glances that suggested they were accustomed to a different approach to business. But they were here because Alexander Sterling delivered results, and results were ultimately what mattered in their world. These people, continued Alexander, warming to his theme, they lack vision, ambition, the drive to better themselves. They're content to serve others, to take orders, to accept whatever scraps they're given instead of fighting for something better. That's not my fault. That's a choice they've made. As if summoned by his words, their waitress approached the table with practiced grace, balancing a tray of appetizers with the skill that came from years of experience in high-end service. She moved with quiet efficiency, her black uniform pristine, her manner professional but unobtrusive in the way that expensive restaurants demanded from their staff. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said with a voice that was cultured and warm, though she kept her eyes focused on the table rather than making direct contact with the diners. "I have your appetizer selection, the oysters Rockefeller, foie gras with fig reduction, and the truffle risotto arancini. Can I refresh anyone's wine?" Alexander barely glanced up from his documents as she placed the dishes with careful precision. To him, she was simply part of the restaurant's ambiance, as invisible and interchangeable as the expensive furniture or the crystal glasses. Her presence was necessary, but unremarkable, confirmation of his earlier point about the service class and their place in the economic hierarchy. "The wine is fine," he said dismissively, his attention still focused on the financial projections. "Just bring the next course when it's ready." The waitress nodded and began to turn away, but Heinrich Müller had noticed something the others had missed. "Excuse me, miss," he said with European politeness, "but I believe we may have met before. You seem familiar." The woman paused, and for just a moment, her carefully composed professional mask slipped. "I don't believe so, sir," she said quietly, but there was something in her voice that suggested otherwise. Alexander looked up from his papers with mild irritation, annoyed that his presentation was being interrupted by small talk with the help. "Let's keep this professional, Heinrich. We don't need to chat with the waitress." But as his eyes focused on the woman standing beside their table, recognition hit him like a physical blow. The world seemed to slow down, the ambient noise of the restaurant fading to a distant hum as he stared at a face he had tried for 5 years to forget. Standing before him, dressed in the black uniform of service staff, was Isabella Rodriguez Sterling, his ex-wife. The crystal wine glass slipped from Alexander's nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of glass and burgundy that stained the white tablecloth like spilled blood. The sound echoed through the suddenly quiet dining room as other patrons turned to see what had caused the disturbance. "Isabella," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a prayer or a curse. The woman, his ex-wife, the love of his life, the person whose absence had left a hole in his heart that no amount of success had been able to fill, stood frozen beside their table. Her face was older now, marked by lines of worry and exhaustion that hadn't been there when they were married, but she was still breathtakingly beautiful. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her makeup minimal but expertly applied, her posture straight, despite the obvious weight of whatever circumstances had brought her to this moment. "Hello, Alex," she said softly, using the nickname that only she had ever been allowed to use, the one that made him feel human instead of just successful. The European investors looked between Alexander and the waitress with growing confusion and fascination, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple business dinner. Other diners were beginning to stare, their own conversations forgotten, as they observed this unexpected drama unfolding in their exclusive sanctuary. "What? What are you doing here?" Alexander managed to say, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Isabella's laugh was bitter, tinged with the kind of pain that comes from dreams deferred and hopes systematically destroyed. "I'm working, Alex. This is my job. But you were..." Alexander struggled to process what he was seeing, his mind unable to reconcile the successful woman he had been married to with the server standing before him. "I was what?" Isabella asked, her voice growing stronger, more defiant. "A successful architect? A woman with her own career and dreams? Someone who was your equal instead of your employee?" The words hung in the air between them like accusations, each one a reminder of the fights they'd had, the fundamental incompatibility that had destroyed their marriage, despite the love they had shared. Alexander's European guests sat in fascinated silence, recognizing that they were witnessing something intensely personal and potentially explosive. "I don't understand," Alexander said, his usual commanding presence reduced to confused vulnerability. "Your firm, your projects, the children's hospital you were designing, all gone," Isabella said with a finality that spoke of battles fought and lost, of a life rebuilt from ruins that others had created. Everything disappeared when Rodriguez and Associates went under. When the economy crashed and the contracts were cancelled, when the loans were called in, when I lost everything I had worked for my entire career. Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, the comfortable assumptions about his ex-wife's life after their divorce crumbling like poorly constructed foundations. He had assumed she was fine, had convinced himself that her absence from his social circle meant she was thriving somewhere else, building the independent life she had claimed to want more than their marriage. "But surely other firms," he began, but Isabella cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. "Other firms?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced around the dining room, remembering where they were and who might be listening. "Do you have any idea how the architecture industry works, Alex? How hard it is to rebuild when you've lost everything? How much harder it is when you're a woman, when you're over 35, when you don't have connections, or a safety net, or a billion-dollar empire to fall back on?" Heinrich Müller cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should give you two some privacy to discuss this matter." But Isabella shook her head firmly. "No, please stay. Mr. Sterling was just explaining to you how people in the service industry lack ambition and vision, how we're content to take orders and accept scraps instead of fighting for something better. I wouldn't want to interrupt such an illuminating conversation." Alexander's face flushed red as his own words were thrown back at him, the casual cruelty of his earlier statements taking on a completely different meaning now that he knew who had been serving them. The European investors exchanged glances that suggested they were rapidly reassessing their opinion of the American billionaire they had come to do business with. "Isabella, I didn't know," he started, but she interrupted him again. "Of course you didn't know," she said, her voice filled with years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. "You never bothered to find out what happened to me after our divorce was finalized. You were too busy building your empire, collecting your trophies, becoming the success story you always wanted to be." The pain in her voice was evident to everyone at the table, and Alexander felt something twist in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine shame. He thought back to their divorce 5 years earlier, to the cold efficiency with which it had been handled by expensive lawyers who had treated their failed marriage like just another business transaction to be resolved. "That's not fair," he said weakly, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew she was right. "Isn't it?" Isabella challenged, her dark eyes flashing with an anger that made her even more beautiful than he remembered. "Tell me, Alex, what did you think happened to me? Did you imagine I just vanished into thin air, that I found some perfect new life that didn't include any consequences from the choices we made together?" Alexander realized with growing horror that he had never really thought about Isabella's life after their divorce, beyond the vague assumption that she was fine, that someone with her talent and drive would naturally land on her feet. It had been easier to believe that than to confront the possibility that their failed marriage might have left her damaged in ways that success and money couldn't heal. "I assumed your career was going well," he said lamely. "You were so talented, so driven." "I was," Isabella agreed, her voice softening slightly. "I was all of those things when we were married. But talent and drive don't protect you from economic downturns, from clients who can't pay their bills, from investors who pull out when the market gets nervous. And they certainly don't protect you from the kind of reputation damage that comes from being associated with a high-profile divorce." Alexander frowned, confused by her last statement. "What do you mean, reputation damage?" Isabella's expression grew bitter. "You really don't know, do you? You never knew about the articles, the speculation about why Alexander Sterling's wife left him, the whispers in professional circles about whether I was unstable, difficult to work with, someone who couldn't maintain her most important relationship." The words hit Alexander like physical blows. He had been so focused on protecting his own image during their divorce, so concerned with maintaining his reputation as a successful businessman, that he had never considered how the public speculation might affect Isabella's career. "I had no idea," he whispered. "Of course you didn't," Isabella said. "You had lawyers and publicists to manage your image, to make sure the divorce reflected well on you. You had the resources to control the narrative, to make sure everyone knew that you were the victim of an ambitious woman who chose her career over her marriage." Alexander's memory of their divorce proceedings began to shift as he considered them from Isabella's perspective. What he had remembered as a clean, professional separation now seemed like a calculated campaign to protect his interests at the expense of hers. "But your firm was established," he protested. "Rodriguez and Associates had a solid reputation, important clients," all of whom started asking questions when the wife of Alexander Sterling suddenly became available for projects, Isabella said. "Questions about my stability, my judgment, my ability to complete long-term commitments. When doubt creeps into client relationships, when investors start questioning your personal life, everything else starts to unravel pretty quickly." Heinrich Müller had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort, recognizing that he and his colleagues were witnessing the aftermath of what appeared to be a deeply painful and complex relationship. "Perhaps we should postpone our meeting," he suggested diplomatically, but Isabella shook her head. "No, please don't let me interrupt your important business discussion about eliminating 1,000 jobs to increase profits. I'm sure those people's families will understand that their livelihoods are just acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of higher returns." Alexander felt the criticism like a slap across the face, especially coming from someone whose own life had been collateral damage in his pursuit of success. "Isabella, that's business. It's not personal." "Everything is personal, Alex," she replied with a sadness that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. "Every decision you make affects real people, with real lives, real families, real dreams. The fact that you can't see that anymore is exactly why our marriage failed." The dining room had grown progressively quieter as their conversation continued, other patrons pretending to focus on their meals while obviously listening to every word of this unexpected drama. The restaurant's manager appeared at the edge of their section, clearly debating whether to intervene in what was becoming an increasingly public spectacle. "Ma'am," the manager said quietly, approaching Isabella with obvious concern about the disruption. "Is everything all right here?" Isabella straightened her shoulders and smoothed her uniform, the professional mask slipping back into place with practiced ease. "Everything is fine, Mr. Peterson. I was just taking the gentleman's order for the next course." But Alexander reached out and caught her wrist gently, the first physical contact they had shared in 5 years, sending an electric shock through both of them. Isabella, wait. Don't go. We need to talk. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up into his eyes with an expression that mixed longing with resignation. We tried talking, Alex. 5 years ago, we talked and talked and talked until there was nothing left to say. You made your choice then, and I'm making mine now. What choice? He asked desperately. What are you talking about? Isabella's smile was infinitely sad. The choice to survive, to rebuild, to find dignity in honest work even when that work isn't what I dreamed of doing. The choice to take care of my daughter instead of chasing dreams that were never going to come true. The words hit Alexander like a thunderbolt. Daughter! What daughter? Isabella's face went pale as she realized what she had revealed, information she had clearly never intended to share. The restaurant manager stepped closer, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond what his establishment could accommodate. I think this conversation should continue elsewhere, Mr. Peterson said firmly but diplomatically. Perhaps you could speak privately after Ms. Rodriguez's shift ends. But Alexander was on his feet now, his chair scraping against the marble floor as he stood with an urgency that made the European investors shrink back in their seats. Isabella, what daughter? Are you saying we have a child? The question echoed through the suddenly silent dining room, and Isabella closed her eyes as if trying to shut out the reality of this moment she had clearly been dreading for years. Not we, Alex, she said quietly. I have a daughter. You have a billion-dollar empire and a reputation to protect. Those are two very different things. Alexander's mind raced through the timeline, calculating dates and possibilities with the same precision he applied to business deals. Their marriage had ended 5 years ago, but the divorce proceedings had taken months to finalize. If Isabella had discovered she was pregnant during that time, how old is she? He whispered. Isabella looked around the dining room, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes watching their every move, the phones that were undoubtedly recording this conversation for social media posterity. This isn't the place, Alex. How old? He repeated, his voice stronger now, more demanding. 4, she said finally. Elena is 4 years old. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow, forcing him to grab the edge of the table for support. He had a daughter. He had a 4-year-old daughter he had never met, never known existed. The woman he had never stopped loving, despite their divorce, had been raising his child alone while he built his empire, and convinced himself that success could fill the emptiness she had left behind. You never told me, he said, his voice breaking with the weight of accusation and disbelief. When was I supposed to tell you? Isabella asked, tears finally beginning to flow down her cheeks despite her attempts to maintain professional composure. During the divorce proceedings, when your lawyers were systematically destroying my reputation. During the custody battles, they told me you would win because you had more money and better connections. Or maybe I should have called you after my firm collapsed when I was working 3 part-time jobs just to pay for Elena's daycare. Each word was like a knife twisting in Alexander's heart, revealing layers of pain and consequence he had never imagined. He thought of all the birthdays he had missed, the first words he hadn't heard, the bedtime stories he had never read. 4 years of his daughter's life were gone forever, stolen by pride and miscommunication and the toxic aftermath of their failed marriage. I had a right to know, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. You had rights, Isabella agreed bitterly. The same rights you talked about exercising when you said you would take Elena away from me if I ever tried to interfere with your life or your business. The same rights your lawyers explained to me in great detail when they outlined exactly what would happen if I ever tried to claim child support or custody. Alexander stared at her in confusion. I never said any of those things. I never had anyone threaten you about custody. Isabella's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. Really, Alex? You don't remember the meeting in your lawyer's office 3 months after Elena was born, when I tried to reach out, tried to tell you about your daughter, when Jonathan Whitmore explained to me very clearly that Mr. Sterling had no interest in complications from his previous marriage, and that any attempts to establish paternity or claim support would be met with the full force of Sterling and Associates' legal team. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face as fragmented memories began to surface. Jonathan Whitmore, his corporate attorney, had indeed mentioned something about Isabella trying to contact him after their divorce. But Jonathan had presented it as harassment, as an unstable ex-wife trying to cause problems. Alexander had trusted his lawyer's judgment, had told him to handle the situation however he thought best. "Jonathan said you were trying to cause problems," he whispered. "He said you were making false claims to get money." "False claims?" Isabella's voice rose dangerously, drawing concerned looks from other diners. "I brought Elena's birth certificate, medical records, everything needed to prove paternity. I wasn't asking for money, Alex. I was asking for acknowledgement. I was asking for my daughter to know her father." The restaurant manager stepped forward again, this time with greater authority. "I'm going to have to ask you to continue this conversation elsewhere. This is disrupting our other guests." But Isabella was beyond caring about discretion now. Years of suppressed anger and hurt finally finding their voice. "You want to know about lacking ambition and drive, Alex? Let me tell you what it's like to be a single mother with no support system, trying to rebuild a career that was destroyed by association with you. Let me explain what it means to work multiple jobs while raising a child who asks every night why she doesn't have a daddy like the other kids at preschool." Alexander reached for her again, desperate to somehow bridge the chasm of pain and misunderstanding that stretched between them. "Isabella, I swear to you, I never knew about Elena. If I had known, everything would have been different." "Would it?" she challenged, her dark eyes blazing with emotion. "Or would you have done exactly what your lawyer suggested, used your money and power to take her away from me? Would you have decided that a waitress wasn't a suitable mother for Alexander Sterling's daughter?" The question hung between them like an accusation, and Alexander realized with growing horror that he couldn't honestly answer it. 5 years ago, at the height of his ambition and his anger over their failed marriage, he might very well have done exactly what she feared. Heinrich Müller cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mr. Sterling, perhaps we should reschedule our meeting. This is clearly a personal matter that requires your attention." But Alexander barely heard him, his focus entirely consumed by the woman standing before him and the devastating revelations she had shared. "Where is she now? Where is Eleanor?" "Safe," Isabella said simply. "Away from all of this, being cared for by people who love her unconditionally instead of seeing her as either an asset or a liability." The words stung because they were true. Alexander's first thought upon learning he had a daughter hadn't been joy or love or wonder. It had been about implications, about how this would affect his carefully constructed life, about what it would mean for his image and his business relationships. "I want to meet her," he said, surprising himself with the intensity of his desire to know this child, who was half of him and half of the woman he had never stopped loving. Isabella's expression softened slightly, revealing the exhaustion and longing underneath her anger. "She's 4 years old, Alex. She doesn't understand why her daddy never came to see her, why he never called on her birthday, why her mommy cries sometimes when she thinks Eleanor isn't looking. You can't just walk back into our lives now that it's convenient for you." "It's not about convenience," Alexander protested. "I didn't know." "But you could have known," Isabella interrupted. "If you had ever bothered to check on me after our divorce, if you had ever wondered what happened to the woman you claimed to love, if you had been even slightly curious about whether our marriage might have left behind consequences more complicated than just divided assets." The accusation was fair and devastating. Alexander realized that he had spent 5 years actively avoiding any information about Isabella's life, partly out of pride and partly out of the fear that learning about her happiness without him would be too painful to bear. His willful ignorance had cost him years with his daughter and had left Isabella to face single motherhood alone and unsupported. "What can I do?" he asked quietly. "How can I make this right?" Isabella looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the war between hope and self-protection playing out in her expression. "You can start by understanding that this isn't about you, Alex. This isn't about your guilt or your regret or your need to fix things. This is about a little girl who deserves better than parents who can't even be in the same room without creating a scene." She gestured around the dining room, where dozens of people were still watching their drama unfold with fascination and horror. Several phones were visible, obviously recording their conversation for later posting on social media. By tomorrow, their personal crisis would be entertainment for millions of strangers. "This is exactly why I never tried to contact you," Isabella continued. "Your life is public, scrutinized, picked apart by people who don't know you but feel entitled to judge every decision you make. Elena deserves better than that. She deserves privacy, stability, a childhood that isn't dominated by paparazzi and gossip columns." Alexander realized she was right, but the knowledge that his fame and success, the things he had worked so hard to achieve, were now obstacles to knowing his daughter, felt like cosmic punishment for his priorities. "We can figure it out," he said desperately. "There has to be a way." "There might be," Isabella said carefully, "but it would require you to do something you've never been particularly good at." "What's that?" "Put someone else's needs before your own," she said simply. "Put Elena's need for stability and normalcy ahead of your desire to be a father. Put her emotional well-being ahead of your guilt and regret." The words were a challenge and a test, and they both knew it. Isabella was asking him to prove that he had changed, that fatherhood meant more to him than just another acquisition or achievement to add to his resume. "I can do that," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. Isabella studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she could trust. "Maybe," she said finally, "but it would have to start with you understanding what Elena's life is actually like, not what you imagine it should be." "Tell me," he said immediately. "She goes to public school because that's what I can afford, even working 2 jobs. She wears clothes from Target and plays with toys from yard sales because designer items aren't in our budget. She's never been on a vacation or stayed in a hotel or eaten at a restaurant like this one. Her world is small and simple, and she's happy in it." Each detail felt like an indictment of his absence, a reminder of the support he should have been providing but never had. "That can change," he said. "I can help with—" "Money isn't the answer to everything, Alex," Isabella interrupted. "Elena doesn't need you to swoop in and change her entire world with your credit card. She needs stability, consistency, someone who shows up not because they feel guilty, but because they genuinely want to be there." Alexander nodded, understanding that this was a different kind of negotiation than he was used to, one where emotional currency mattered more than financial resources. "What would you need from me? What would it take for you to trust me with this?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Time," she said finally. "Not money or grand gestures or dramatic changes. Just time, consistent, reliable, patient time spent getting to know her and letting her get to know you." "I can do that," Alexander said immediately, but Isabella held up a hand to stop him. "You say that now, but what happens when you get bored? When the novelty wears off and being a father becomes another obligation competing with board meetings and business trips? What happens when Eleanor needs you to miss an important deal because she's sick, or cancel a dinner with investors because she has a school play?" The questions were designed to make him think about the reality of parenthood, not just the idealized version he might have imagined. They were also clearly born from experience. Isabella knew what it was like to have responsibilities that couldn't be delegated or rescheduled. "I would choose her," he said. But even as he spoke, he wondered if that was true. His entire life was built around the assumption that business came first, that success required sacrifices in personal relationships. "Would you?" Isabella asked skeptically. When choosing her means disappointing clients, missing opportunities, potentially losing deals worth millions of dollars? Alexander started to answer immediately, then stopped, realizing that she deserved honest consideration rather than easy promises. He thought about his schedule, his commitments, the way his life was structured around maximizing profit and minimizing anything that interfered with business objectives. I don't know, he admitted finally, but I want to find out. I want the chance to try. Isabella's expression softened slightly at his honesty. That's the first entirely truthful thing you've said tonight. The restaurant manager approached their table again, this time with obvious determination. I'm very sorry, but I really must insist that you continue this conversation elsewhere. We have other guests to consider. Isabella immediately straightened and stepped back from the table, her professional demeanor returning as she remembered where they were and what her job required. Of course, Mr. Peterson. I apologize for the disruption. But Alexander stood as well, pulling out his wallet and throwing several $100 bills on the table without counting them. The dinner is over, he announced to his confused European guests. I'll call you tomorrow to reschedule. Heinrich Müller and his colleagues exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that their business meeting had become secondary to whatever was happening between Alexander and Isabella. Of course, Heinrich said diplomatically. We understand completely. Alexander turned back to Isabella, who was watching him with surprise. When does your shift end? Alex, I don't think. When does it end? He repeated. 11 o'clock, she said reluctantly. I'll wait, he said simply. Isabella shook her head. That's not necessary. This conversation doesn't need to continue tonight. Yes, it does, Alexander said with quiet intensity. We've lost 5 years, Isabella. I'm not losing another day. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her internal struggle between hope and self-protection, between the desire to believe he had changed and the fear that trusting him would lead to more disappointment. I'll wait in the lobby, he said when she didn't respond. If you decide you're ready to talk, I'll be there. If not, I'll understand. Isabella nodded slowly, then turned and walked away, her professional composure intact, despite the emotional earthquake that had just reshaped both of their worlds. Alexander watched her go, then turned back to his abandoned business partners with an expression that mixed apology and determination. I'm sorry for ruining your evening, gentlemen. This deal will have to wait. Some things are more important than business, Heinrich said, with understanding that spoke of his European perspective on work-life balance. We hope everything works out for you. As the investors departed and the other diners gradually returned to their conversations, Alexander found himself alone at the table that had become the epicenter of his personal revelation. He looked around the expensive restaurant, seeing it now through Isabella's eyes as a symbol of the privilege and insulation that had allowed him to remain ignorant of her struggles and their daughter's existence. For the first time in years, Alexander Sterling didn't know what came next. He had built his empire on the foundation of control, of being able to predict and manipulate outcomes through careful planning and superior resources. But parenthood wasn't a business deal, and Isabella wasn't a client to be convinced or a competitor to be defeated. She was the woman he had never stopped loving, the mother of his child, and possibly his last chance to become the kind of man who deserved the family he had never known he wanted until tonight. The next 3 hours passed like an eternity. Alexander sat in the lobby of Meridian Tower, watching late-night office workers and restaurant staff come and go, thinking about everything Isabella had told him and everything he had failed to understand about the consequences of their divorce. He thought about Elena, trying to imagine what his 4-year-old daughter looked like, what her voice sounded like, what made her laugh or cry or wonder about the world. The thought that she might have his eyes or Isabella's smile, that she might be curious about business or passionate about architecture, that she might be anything at all, filled him with a longing he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. At 11:15, Isabella emerged from the elevator, having changed from her uniform into jeans and a simple sweater that somehow made her look even more beautiful than the designer clothes she used to wear. She paused when she saw him, as if surprised that he had actually waited. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," she said quietly. "I told you I would be," Alexander replied, standing up from the leather chair where he had been waiting. They walked out into the Manhattan night, the city around them buzzing with the energy that never quite died in New York. Streetlights created pools of illumination on the sidewalks, and the distant sound of traffic and sirens provided a backdrop for their conversation. "There's a coffee shop around the corner that stays open late," Isabella said. "We could talk there." They walked in silence for a few blocks, both lost in their own thoughts about what had happened and what might come next. The coffee shop was nearly empty at this hour, just a few night shift workers and insomniacs seeking caffeine and warmth. They chose a table in the back corner, away from the other customers. "Tell me about her," Alexander said once they had ordered their drinks. "Tell me about Elena." Isabella's face lit up in a way that reminded Alexander of the woman he had fallen in love with 10 years earlier. "She's incredible, Alex. She's smart and funny and curious about everything. She asks a million questions about how things work and why people do the things they do. She loves to draw and build things with blocks, and she has this laugh that just fills up whatever room she's in." Alexander found himself smiling despite the pain of having missed all of this. "She sounds amazing." "She is," Isabella said, "and she's also stubborn and dramatic and occasionally throws epic tantrums when she doesn't get her way. She's a real person with real feelings and real needs, not some fantasy of what a perfect child should be." The warning in her words was clear. Fatherhood would require dealing with difficult moments as well as magical ones, with responsibility as well as joy. "I want all of it," Alexander said quietly. "The tantrums and the questions and the laughter. I want to know her, Isabella. I want to be her father." Isabella studied his face, searching for sincerity behind the words. "It's not part-time, Alex. You can't be a father when it's convenient and disappear when it's not. Children need consistency, reliability, someone they can count on no matter what else is happening." "I understand," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure he did. "Do you?" Isabella challenged. "Because 3 hours ago you were talking about eliminating 1,000 jobs like they were numbers on a spreadsheet. You were dismissing service workers as people who lacked ambition and vision. If that's how you see the world, how you see people who don't have your advantages, then you're not ready to be Elena's father." The criticism stung because it was accurate. Alexander realized that fatherhood would require him to examine not just his priorities, but his entire worldview, his assumptions about success and worth, and what made life meaningful. "I can change," he said. "Maybe," Isabella said, "but change takes time, and Elena can't wait for you to figure out who you want to be. She needs stability now, not promises about who you might become." Alexander nodded, understanding that this wasn't a negotiation he could win through persistence or superior offers. Isabella held all the cards, and she was right to be cautious about protecting their daughter from disappointment. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "What would convince you that I'm serious about this?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with obvious care. "Consistency," she said finally. "Show up when you say you will. Do what you promise to do. Put Eleanor's needs ahead of your convenience, even when it costs you something important." "I can do that," Alexander said immediately. "Can you?" Isabella asked. "Can you miss a board meeting because Elena is sick and needs to go to the doctor? Can you turn down a lucrative deal because it would require travel during her school play? Can you choose being her father over being Alexander Sterling, billionaire businessman?" The questions forced Alexander to confront the reality that fatherhood would require sacrifices he had never had to make, compromises with his carefully structured life that might affect his business success. "I think so," he said honestly. "I want to try." Isabella nodded slowly. "Then we'll start small, very small. Maybe a phone call if Elena wants to talk to you. Maybe a brief meeting in a neutral location where she feels safe. We'll see how it goes. Alexander felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. The prospect of talking to his daughter, of trying to build a relationship with a 4-year-old who didn't know he existed, was both thrilling and terrifying. "What should I say to her?" he asked. "The truth," Isabella said simply, "that you're her father, that you didn't know about her before, that you want to get to know her if she's interested. But Alex, you have to be prepared for the possibility that she might not want to know you right away. She's been fine without you for 4 years. Your presence in her life has to be about what she needs, not what you want." Alexander nodded, understanding that his daughter's feelings and reactions would have to take priority over his own desire to be part of her life. They talked for another hour, with Isabella sharing stories about Eleanor's personality and preferences, her favorite books and games, the routines and rituals that made up her daily life. Alexander listened with fascination and growing love for a child he had never met, but already cared about, more than he had thought possible. "There's something else you need to understand," Isabella said as they prepared to leave. "Elena and I are a package deal. If you want to be in her life, you'll be in mine too, at least peripherally. We'll need to communicate, coordinate, make decisions together. Can you handle that?" The question carried layers of complexity, their shared history, the attraction that still existed between them despite everything that had happened, the possibility that co-parenting might revive feelings they had both tried to bury. "I think so," Alexander said. "Can you?" Isabella's smile was sad and uncertain. "I don't know, but I'm willing to try for Eleanor's sake." They walked back toward the subway station where Isabella would catch the train to Brooklyn, where she and Elena lived in a small apartment that was all she could afford on a waitress's salary. Alexander offered to drive her home or pay for a taxi, but she declined, maintaining the independence that had sustained her through 5 years of single motherhood. "I'll call you tomorrow," Alexander said as they reached the subway entrance. "We can set up a time for me to talk to Elena, if you think she's ready." Isabella nodded. "I'll talk to her first, explain who you are and why you want to meet her. I won't pressure her, but I'll give her the choice." Alexander wanted to hug her goodbye, to somehow bridge the physical and emotional distance that still existed between them, but he settled for a handshake that lingered longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me this chance, for raising her alone when I should have been helping, for being stronger than I ever was." Isabella's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Don't thank me yet, Alex. Thank me if you're still here 6 months from now, when the novelty has worn off and being a father feels like work instead of an adventure." As Isabella disappeared down the subway stairs, Alexander stood alone on the Manhattan sidewalk, surrounded by the city that had made him rich and successful, but had somehow failed to make him happy. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility of something more meaningful than profit margins and stock prices. But he also understood that earning the right to be Elena's father would be the most challenging negotiation of his life, one where the stakes weren't money or market share, but love, trust, and the chance to become the kind of man his daughter deserved. The next morning, Alexander did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He cancelled all his meetings and spent the day walking around Manhattan, thinking about what kind of father he wanted to be and what kind of changes he would need to make to become that person. He thought about Isabella, about the strength it must have taken to rebuild her life from nothing while raising a child alone. He thought about Elena, about the little girl who didn't know her father existed, but might, if he was very careful and very patient, give him the chance to earn a place in her world. And for the first time since their divorce, Alexander Sterling began to understand that the most important success of his life had nothing to do with money, power, or recognition. It had everything to do with becoming worthy of the love of 2 people who had every reason not to trust him, but might, just maybe, be willing to try. The story of their reunion was just beginning, but already Alexander knew that everything he had built, everything he had achieved, meant nothing compared to the possibility of hearing a 4-year-old girl call him Daddy, and mean it. That chance, fragile, uncertain, and completely beyond his ability to control, was worth more than all his billions combined.